Good reason.
Hello, everybody. Welcome to another episode of the Thriving Adoptees podcast. So today I'm delighted to be joined by Anne Haralambie. Welcome to the show, and looking forward to our discussion today.
Very happy to be here, Simon.
So Anne, another fellow adoptee. Anne was born back in 51, and we had a conversation a month or so ago, and in that Anne said that she'd never felt that you'd had trauma, right? You'd felt pain, but you didn't feel wounded. So can you expand a little bit on that?
Yeah, I mean, my first memory in life was being told I was adopted, and I don't remember what my mother said to me. I remember the place. I remember some kind of understanding that there was another mother I had that I was never going to see. I cried, she cried. I was about 2.5, and the pain of that, and why I didn't have, why I wasn't with another mother, was something that really was something that ran through my entire life. I mean, sometimes it was right on the surface, sometimes it wasn't. It was always there. Cried many tears in secret, because I didn't want my parents or anybody else to know the pain I was feeling. But interestingly enough, even though I'm a child custody and child abuse lawyer and have been for 46 years and dealt with child abuse and trauma and the psychology of trauma, I never really attached that term to what I had been feeling. And so I internalized a lot of the pain was my fault. I was too weak, or I wasn't grateful enough, or why wasn't I good enough, to have my parents keep me, because my adoptive parents thought that my birth parents were married Catholics, which turned out they weren't. But that raised a lot of questions to me. Why does the child of a married Catholic couple end up being adopted? So somehow, even in my, childhood, fantasies, trying to fill in the blanks of information I didn't have, I imagined all kinds of tragedies happening that would explain it. But somehow, as children usually do, I internalized that as somehow being my fault, or I was somehow, to blame for the situation. But I didn't identify it as trauma until, oddly enough, many, many years later, I was reading Nancy Verrier's book, The Primal Wound. I read it 20 or more years after it was published. So even though I was pretty conversant with adoptee literature, I hadn't read that one. And I was floating on my lake in some kind of inflatable reading the book. And when I realized that the separation from my birth mother, even though I was not badly treated by anybody along the way, was trauma. And so it literally was an aha moment for me. I think I even uttered the words, "Oh my God," sitting there on the lake. This explains everything. And by the way, it's not my fault. I'm not to blame. It's not that I'm weak. It's not that I have some kind of flaw in my character. There was a trauma that I experienced. And with that understanding, I was able to start to extend myself the kind of grace and compassion that I extended to my child clients who were abused in much more obvious ways. And if somebody was scalded or had broken bones or things like that, it was easy for me to understand that that was trauma. And I actually had studied a fair amount about trauma in my role as a child welfare lawyer. But to think that trauma could occur when there wasn't something horrendous and visible that was seen. I wasn't raped. I wasn't physically abused. I wasn't, in a war zone. I didn't have something some circumstance that everybody would realize, oh yes, this could cause trauma in this child, and this could explain a lot of why she is who she is. And it took me a while, and I think I'm still in the process of understanding the depth of that. But at least I started to let myself off the hook a little bit and to give some more grace to everybody else involved.
Yeah.
Society just didn't understand that there was any trauma involved in infant adoption, period.
Yeah. So you've mentioned the word grace a couple of times. You've said this explains everything. Was this a relief for you? How would you sum up the emotional reaction to that?
It was definitely a relief. I mean, it didn't take away all the pain. And it certainly didn't take away my anger at the whole sealed records. Why can't I have my own birth certificate? This is not somebody else's record. It is my record. And, I had a lot of anger, still have a lot of anger about that kind of thing. But it let me off the hook to the extent that I didn't see myself as so inherently flawed or unworthy as I had. And Bruce Perry, who's a major expert in trauma and dealt with the kids in the Branch Davidian, David Koresh, Waco fiasco, and was looking at the cortisol levels in their brain, and even at rest were elevated from the trauma they had been through. Well, Bruce Perry and Oprah Winfrey wrote a book called, I think this is the title of it, What Happened to You? And they posed a very profound question that we use whenever we're dealing with damaged people or situations where somebody, we would think in our mind, what's wrong with you? There's something wrong with you. And they said it should be framed differently. The question should not be what's wrong with you, but what happened to you. And that's the same kind of thing, the question to be asked, that I think dovetails very nicely with the whole concept of the primal wound. Something happened to me, and it happened at a stage in my development where I had no words or context to be able to do anything with it. And what we know about memory in child development is, and I don't know if this is getting too geeky for you, but
No.
What we know is, in order to have memories, you first have to have encoded the memory and then stored it so it's available later for retrieval. And there are a lot of reasons why people, even adults, may not correctly encode or store their memories. But for an infant, you don't have words or context. So it is impossible to even encode that to end up as a memory that you can later cognitively retrieve and talk about. Now, I think I don't necessarily have a whole lot of robust statistics, but I think people also, I know I encode memories for smells and sights. And, if I'm pumping my own gas, which I always do, the smell of the gasoline fumes brings me back to my childhood in New Hampshire summers of taking the boat, to the dock at the store that had the gas can, and my father filling it. And so that takes me back to New Hampshire. If I smell manure, horse manure, takes me back to riding. So I know that those kinds of non-cognitive, things can get in your memory, and you can retrieve them. But when people talk to adoptees very dismissively, and I think they probably do it less now than they did back in the 50s and 60s and 70s, they talk about, well, that's just mere curiosity. To which I say, the hell it is. It's not mere curiosity. People tried to come up with words, the void, but we didn't have the words. And Nancy Verrier explained why we don't have the words, because we didn't encode the trauma in a way that included words or context. We weren't able to have somebody explain to us, the minute we were taken from our mothers, maybe never to have any contact again, what happened. And when somebody later, for me at age 2.5, when somebody tried to give me words and a context, which I was able to encode and store and later retrieve in very fragmented ways, there was some other mother out there somewhere and I couldn't be with her. That was all that developmentally at 2.5 I was able to get out of it. But at least I was able to get that. But I still hadn't labeled it as trauma. And when I later found out that my mother, like virtually every other birth mother of that era, was an unwed teenager, she was a junior in college. She'd had a long-term relationship with my father, but for a lot of reasons, he wasn't, appropriate to marry. And they had broken up a few months before she realized she was pregnant. She was a good Catholic girl. You're not supposed to have sex before marriage and all of that. So when I understood, okay, that makes total sense. And boy, don't I wish I had been told that much earlier in my life, before I grieved over causing my mother's death in childbirth, or having a fire in the apartment from which my birth father would have rescued me, but didn't have time to go back and get my mother. And so again, I was, the cause, but for me, he could have rescued my mother. And all of these things that were very, very painful to me, and that I cried about and processed all of these emotions about scenarios that were totally untrue and had nothing to do with me. Excuse me. And if I had been told early on what the true story was, I think I could have said, okay, that was the right decision. I didn't want to be raised as a love child in the 50s. And it was not okay to raise a quote, illegitimate child, which of course was the label they put on the child, not on the adults who were responsible for doing the deed. It would have been a lot easier. And, I still probably at an early age wouldn't have understood that that was trauma. I think I would have understood more the trauma on my mother's side. And even growing up, I had where I was placing my compassion and grace was on my birth mother. And, you didn't think about a birth father until much later. It was all about babies and their mothers.
Yeah.
And of course, I didn't understand, again, the intrauterine connection and the hearing the heartbeat and your mother moving around and, all of the other sort of magical things that happen between a mother and her unborn child.
Yeah. So can I take you back to the, you said that this, reading The Primal Wound, there was a relief and it took you off the hook. What do you mean by that? What do you mean by taking you off the hook?
It meant that something had happened to me that was outside of me, that was a circumstance that affected parts of me deep enough, in my brain that I couldn't control it at the time. Just like a child who gets a broken bone, the bone can heal, but you still broke your bone and you still know that your mother's boyfriend swinging you around by your arm is the one who did it. So I could say more that now I have to learn to deal with this in a different way that does not make me less than, does not make me damaged goods unworthy, as in a character flaw, it's my fault. It means that something physiologically happened to me that altered certain things about my thoughts and my feelings on basically a biological level. And being a very cognitive person, I've always lived in that part of my brain that talks and writes and, figures things out. But seeing that those things happen in a different part of my brain, I had to say, okay, then the part of my brain that I live in my relationships with people, in my legal business, that isn't what's going to correct the issue. I have to deal with it on a more psychological and even a spiritual basis. And Verrier, and I can't remember whether she says it in The Primal Wound or the sequel, Coming Home to Self, but somewhere she talks about the connection between the birth mother and the child in utero is also a psychological and even a spiritual connection. And there's a scripture that says, of course, the Right to Life people, this is, one of their big scriptures, that, while you were yet in your mother's womb, I, meaning God, knew you. And so there was a sense that there was a spiritual connection in me having to do with my having been conceived and born. And I totally believe, just as a spiritual matter, that no life comes into being without the breath of God, or God's, okay. And maybe we can make the best of it in a bad situation, but I think that God knows. There's another scripture that says, before you were born, I knew you. So I realized that I could start to deal with this really more on a spiritual level and a psychological level, and get it out of my cognitive, intellectual, well, of course, this was my mother's appropriate choice. And, of course, I am happy having been raised in a good home where nobody abused me. And as a child abuse lawyer, you really get a sense of gratitude. I mean, I told my father once, it was a bizarre moment. I had written a book on child sexual abuse, and I was at a legal conference talking about it. And, I said to my dad, thank you for not molesting me. Well, he was a pediatrician and he was not a pedophile, and, he never crossed any lines. Just kind of a bizarre thing to say. But as someone who dealt with it with other kids and seeing, the tremendous trauma and after effects of that trauma, I was thinking about the positive things and the trauma that I didn't have, while at the same time starting to understand that I would need to deal with myself in a trauma-informed way.
Yeah. So if I was to sum it up, you've said you had this question: why wasn't I good enough?
Yes.
And then essentially reading the Primal Wound and realizing that this was about trauma, that kind of blew that question out of the water, the why wasn't I good enough question, because your innate quality, you saw your innate quality. You saw that this was something to do with, or this was all about trauma and nothing about your inherent quality as a person.
Right. And I knew that cognitively, but getting that into your emotional self, and which isn't to say there aren't still hooks that go back to, why am I not good enough for XYZ? I mean, my husband left me, divorced me Why wasn't I good enough,
Okay,
to stay married?
this is so there's a really big point here, I think. 1 point or two. The first one, you're talking about the depth, the depth of an understanding, right? So we can get stuff in our heads, in our hearts, or in our bones. So you're
Yes.
talking about the depth of that understanding.
Yes.
That's one thing. So for us to be aware of is getting stuff cognitively in the head, getting stuff emotionally in our heart, or getting our stuff as like what I think people call this as a what do they call this? An embodied understanding. An embodied. It's all of you. It's
Yes.
not just a vague theory. It's not just a thought that happens to you once. So that's one thing, that there's this depth of understanding. And as a society, I don't think we talk a lot about that. We think of knowing stuff like knowing our times tables from school, or knowing that 2 + 2 = 4. Knowledge is often portrayed as a 1 or a 0 thing. It's like, especially in this digital age, it's either yes or a no. It's not about depth. And so that's one thing that you're drawing us attention to. And the other thing that you're drawing our attention to, which I think is even bigger, is just because we get this stuff, we understand our quality at a cellular level, our inherent quality, doesn't mean that the odd thought doesn't come up, right?
Absolutely.
Yeah. So what this is, the reason I'm laboring this or reinforcing it really is because it's something that I've struggled with, and if I've struggled with it, then the likelihood is that other people have struggled with it. You've seen it. You said, well, just because I've had this, it doesn't. I've had this very deep embodied understanding of my own inherent quality. It doesn't mean that I never have the "I'm not good enough" thought, because our brains will latch onto the fact, and they'll say, right, because they're going back to that. They're going back to that place of understanding is a yes or a no. And then there's frustration. You think, well, we think we've learned the lesson, and these random thoughts are coming back up again, especially something like a divorce. It's totally understandable, and we have moved on, and rather than this frustration of us having to go, the fact that we've gone all back to the start again. That's not the truth, right?
Right. But, and I think it's probably, it was so deeply ingrained that I think it's going to bubble up for the rest of my life. And it's a matter of, and that's where I think grace comes in, and the importance of giving myself grace, as well as giving grace to, everybody else that was involved, other than the agency and the laws that set up a system that is only on the surface for the interests of the child. I mean, my whole career has been to try and serve the best interests of the child. And, it was a phrase, if you look at adoption, the stereotypical, at least older version of adoption, with the unwed mother relinquishing or surrendering her child to the married couple. And the mother is told, you have to think about the best interests of the child. You're a single woman, you have no money, you're going to bring shame on the family. You have to place this child for the child's best interest. The child will be raised by people with more money, with people who are married, who are more stable, will have a better life. And on the flip side of that, the adoptive parents are screened, or again, we're in a different situation now, where most US adoptions are out of children in foster care, or in people who get infants basically do international adoptions, which has its own other problems that I don't want to get into. But, the adoptive parents are screened to see if they are good enough to raise somebody else's child. And, would they be in the best interest of the child, to take this child and adopt this child. But at some point, the actual child and the actual child's best interests are subverted to, you can't be disloyal to your adoptive parents. And I know you know this because any of us who have talked to hundreds of adoptees, at some point or another, a large proportion of them are told things like, how could you do this to your adoptive parents? You ought to get down on your hands and knees and thank God that they took you in and treated you as if you were their very own. Which, of course, how you can never repay the debt of their charity and beneficence. Yeah. And the aha moment I had regarding that was when I had represented some adoptive parents in private adoptions. I've never been willing to place a child. I will not do it and have never done it. But if somebody's already had the child identified for them, either through friends or relatives or their pastor or their doctor or whatever, and it was already a done deal, then I would represent them in doing it. And when I would go to the hospital with them, because this was now in the 70s and 80s where, adoptive parents actually got the child fairly soon after birth in many cases. And I saw, hey, these people are getting something out of this. These people really wanted a child. This is like the answer to their prayers. And I don't know why it never occurred to me until I was a lawyer on the side of the adoptive parents that I realized this isn't, the charity of scraping some kid out of the sewer and raising them as if they were your own. These were people who really wanted this child and loved the child and did consider the child to be their own. And then the other half of it, when we start to search, and again, it's not as much of a problem now. It's still somewhat of a problem, but I mean, I started searching back when adoption search was very brand new. Florence Fisher and Betty Jean Lifton and Annette Barron, all of those people, that's when I kind of entered, when they were doing things. And, people would say, how can you do this to your birth mother? I'm sure she now is married and has her own children and a husband has made a life for her. Basically, that this slut, who made this horrible mistake has now reformed, and you showing up, you are now going to ruin her life. And so that was a burden that adoptees carried with respect to their birth mother, to not ruin her life. So you were either going to be, a disloyal ingrate to your adoptive parents and or, ruin your birth mother's life. So of course, if you're a decent person, your brain is telling you, well, then my quote need to know, or my desire to heal from my trauma, or even my desire, which I expressed, at the time I started searching, I want to let my mother know I turned out okay. I was treated well. She made the right decision, and take that burden from her of guilt and wondering, why she had made the right decision or what had happened to her. I mean, I never took drugs, not tried a marijuana joint, nothing. I was, the unicorn of my generation in that regard. I didn't have sex till I got married. I tried to live a very straight and narrow life. And yet birth mothers that I talked to and have represented, were worried, oh my gosh, coming of age in the 60s and 70s, did my kid get into drugs and promiscuity and die of an overdose or have a horrible life or whatever. And there's so much healing that could happen for everybody that was stopped by putting this burden on the adopted child that, and at least now we're calling them adoptees, but that's fairly recent. Didn't matter how old you were an adopted child.
Yeah.
But now all of that burden was on us to not make everybody else feel bad. And the heck with, the fact that we were traumatized, that we could use healing, that we could bring healing. And I got healing, even though my mother died 2 years before I found, and never told anybody. And I was the big shame. And also she was traumatized, according to my uncle. And while I had some good conversations with my birth father, also a lawyer, he ultimately decided he did not want to acknowledge me. And so I didn't have, the happy reunion with my birth parents, although I have some cousins and other people that I'm in relationship with, some very important. But it brought some level of healing to me in a way that, again, I can't really express very well. I tried in my book to express it, but I don't think I necessarily was that great with getting the depth of what it really means to be able to give myself grace and to give other adoptees grace, whether they have the wonderful reunions, whether they are angry and think adoption is just child trafficking and should be wiped off the face of the earth, and everything in between. But I think grace, and for me, that's a spiritual thing that I can offer myself and others only because God offered grace to me. But I think that, that has helped me. The title of your podcast and your website is Thriving Adoptees. And I think I'm finally thriving sitting in my adoption more than I did, and hope that other people can get to that point. But in that acceptance and grace, still be fierce advocates for changing a system that imposes and continues to impose pain and frustration on all of us.
Yeah.
Didn't mean to be so preachy.
I think it is that thing about it being hard to put healing into words. It is, and I'm into spiritual stuff, but not like religious stuff. So I believe. So we use I use the word consciousness rather than spirit, or God. From my view outside looking in and hearing what you've got to say, that one of the key moments was the demise of the why I wasn't, I'm not good enough belief.
Yes.
That's what stands out to me.
But it still doesn't take away the why do I have to suffer these things? I mean, I felt that with my divorce. And then when my daughter died unexpectedly at 41, my only child, she has one child. So that, until I found my birth family, that was the sum total of my genetic family, was my daughter and then my grandson. And I'm thinking, gee, I have one child. Why does this stuff, happen to me? And there are no answers to those kinds of questions, and having to learn, that I have a pretty pruned down genetic tree, but how to deal with that, and how to hope that in her lifetime I gave her grace. And I am a person of faith, so I do believe that there is a heaven and an afterlife, and that the Bible says that all things will be revealed. And I'm hoping that I'll get to meet my birth mother in the hereafter and reunite with my adoptive parents and my daughter and all of the people that I've loved who have gone before me. But, I have to keep pulling myself back and realizing, that stuff happens. We don't all have easy lives. Some of us, our lives are very easy in some ways. I never had to worry about, the threat on the other side of the bedroom door. I didn't have to worry about being abused or not having enough food or, not getting an education or being able to support myself. But there are still wounds and lacks and traumas that happen. I mean, the death of a child is a trauma, obviously. But learning how to deal with one trauma, I think, maybe helps in dealing with another trauma.
Yeah. How do you think? How does that look to you? How do you think that familiarity with one trauma helps you deal with another?
One thing that I started saying to myself, probably starting, back with my divorce in 1973, when I hadn't even, I started law school a couple of years after that. But, I started saying, okay, Lord, I look at examples in the Bible. I look at Job, who, my God, had everything taken from him. I look at, the 3 Hebrew children put in the fire and the Lord brought him out of the fire. I look at Lazarus, who died and was raised from the dead. I looked at people who, like Jesus, who was crucified and suffered all of that pain. So I started saying, okay, Lord, if you can, just as Jesus said, Lord, if this cup can pass away from me on the cross, but if not, thy will be done, basically. And so I started thinking, particularly when I was a lawyer, okay, Lord, if I have to go through this, I've gone through 2 major clinical depressions in my life, one related to my divorce. If I have to go through this, at least on the other side of it, let me have learned something that I can help somebody else with. Let me have some degree of compassion that I can offer to other people, understanding from someone who's been in the crucible that can make it better. Just like I was hoping with my birth mother, something bad happened to her. She got pregnant when she didn't want to and when it wasn't convenient, but let me have made something good out of that. Let me somehow have been, a counterbalance to the shame and the pain. And so that's how I have approached other things, including my daughter's death, including my divorce. And I think it's made me a better lawyer, handling clients who come through a divorce. I don't trivialize the pain of that. Dealing with clients who have had, or are in the middle of a major clinical depression, I know what that's like. I know what it's like to be able to function as a lawyer and come home and go into my bed and cry and not want to wake up the next morning. So if I can give my pain or my trauma some purpose, I think I will have done the best I can do.
Yeah. Well, I think you're doing that. I think you're doing that right now with what you're sharing.
And it's really, it's a lot of why I decided to write a memoir, because, and why I waited really 14 years after I found and a year after my birth father died to do it, because I wanted to have some insights. Yes, I wanted to write a good and interesting story that has a lot of twists and turns and whatever, but I wanted to have some insights that could maybe help somebody else in the triad some other adoptee feel they're not alone, that many of us have gone through exactly the same kinds of things, and we each find a little piece of insight. And if we share that insight with somebody else, then maybe that can help them.
Yeah.
And maybe we can look back and, the real concept in terms of vocabulary of giving myself and other people grace really came through the writing of the book. I hadn't thought of it, putting that word to it. Even though I think that I was trying to do that anyway. But for me, being a verbal person, having the word makes it easier and makes it more the ability to have an aha moment, like the word trauma was for me in reading The Primal Wound.
Yeah. My own experience with reading The Primal Wound was similar in the first instance to yours, and almost identical. You said this explains everything, right? That's what I felt. That's what I felt when I read it. So much so that I tracked my Amazon history. I do remember reading it in pretty much in one sitting, the first book, and I looked at my Amazon history, and I bought the second book probably 2 weeks afterwards.
Me too.
Yeah, I found the second book just, well, impossible, really. I mean, you've talked about the kind of like the spiritual connections. You talked about psychological side and the emotional side. For me, all the profound stuff happens at a spiritual level, right?
Yes.
And that's what she was explaining in the first book. But the second book is all psychological, and it's, I guess it's like it's like the musicians say, you've got the whole of your life. You've had the whole of your life to write your first album, and then you've got 6 months to find your second album, and it's the difficult second album, and that's the thing I found with the second book.
I read it as a lawyer. I read it the way that I read other psychological books about abuse and other professional books about abuse, and then also was applying the things there. But I think in a lot of ways she was trying to aim that towards the mental health community and towards professionals working with adoptees, as much as I mean, she of course was not an adoptee. She was an adoptive mother trying as a therapist. I think she had a master's degree in psychology to help understand what her adopted daughter was going through.
Yeah.
And so I think she was writing that a lot for the adoptee and the adoptive parent to understand that. And then I think in Coming Home to Self, I think a lot of it was, and I haven't read it in a while, so from my memory, I kind of the snapshot I take away from it, it was much more aimed, or at least I read it more with wearing my hat as a professional dealing with abuse and trauma.
Yeah.
At least as much, if not quite a bit more, than dealing with it as the traumatized child.
Yeah. Do you think, have you heard this phrase? It's one that I've used quite a lot on the podcast, but not so much recently. This idea that we are spiritual beings having a human experience.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Do you think that this is really a loaded question, because we're just debating it, right? Do you think that spiritual being can be wounded?
I do think so.
Okay.
I do think. I mean, and I have expressed things, for example, discrimination. Let's take discrimination against Black people, discrimination against LGBTQ,
Yeah.
I'm not sure of all the letters,
Yeah.
people, or discrimination against any people, especially if it is for who they are. I mean, God made a Black person, God made an Asian person, God made all of us. And I feel a spiritual wound, and have always expressed it that way, when I see people discriminating against it. And it deeply affects me. I mean, brings me to tears to see discrimination. And, of course, in the United States, and, the last 6 years, we've seen more of it than at a lot of times. But even as a young child, when I saw people being discriminated on the basis of race, I mean, it enraged me, but it wounded some part of my spirit. John Donne, years and years, centuries ago, wrote "For Whom the Bell Tolls," and he says, "Seek not to know for whom the bell tolls; it tolls for thee." And he talks about we're all part of this human race. We're all part of this body. The Christian church would call it the body of Christ for some of us, but we are all made by God, and a wound to one wounds, I think, the spiritual body. And those kinds of things offend me on a different level than on an intellectual or even an emotional level. And I think that, and I talk about my spirit being wounded. So I absolutely think that's a thing.
Yeah. So looking at some stuff around this consciousness space. If we were to look at something around consciousness, around there's something called non-duality, where we talk about the awareness as being aware of, so it's the difference between what we are aware of, right? We're aware of our trauma, but that's the content of our consciousness, rather than consciousness itself. Or looking at another, perhaps an easier to understand metaphor than that, is the screen. We're looking at each other, pictures of each other on the screen. But if we're watching a television program, right, the television screen is untouched by the drama that appears on it. So I'm thinking about a trauma like a car crash, or you talked about Waco earlier on, like a shooting. So the screen isn't damaged by the movie. The screen doesn't laugh at the rom-com. The screen doesn't cry at the watch when Roots comes on, right? So Alex Haley, Roots, that terrible stuff that happened to
and that was a spiritual wound for,
well,
I think,
yeah, I guess it's how we define the word spirit and consciousness. But I see spirit as actually unwoundable. What that's kind of my take on it, and I guess that's what we're really talking about, is our personal
I
take.
think it is not ever able to be lethally wounded, because I think the spirit will always persist. And I think that the spirit, that the spirit is a separate thing that is eternal and unkillable to that
Yeah.
extent. But I think it can still suffer wounds.
Yeah. Interesting.
And I think the wounds can be healed. But in the moment, I think it can feel the wound. Not
Yeah.
every wound leaves a scar.
Indeed. I'm playing with this. I'm playing with my communication and my messaging on this, because clearly I'm not there yet, right? I came up with this idea of a spiritual stab vest. Okay. So the idea here is it's a metaphor. So the primal wound is a metaphor, right? It's a diagnosis. It's a metaphor. I have felt wounded, but have I been wounded? So this idea of the spiritual stab vest I came up with. So I'm in the wrong part of town. I've taken a side street that's dimly lit, but there is one light. As I'm walking down the side street, I see a glint. I see the glint, and then I realise that there's a mugger there, with a hoodie on, so dark, dressed in dark clothes, and in a flash he's on me, right, and he shoves the knife at me. He jabs the knife at me. I feel the pain, right? It hits me so hard. I'm winded, right? Then I feel him going through my pockets. He takes the wallet off me. He runs away. I reach down inside my jacket, because I can still feel this pain, and I'm looking. I think I'm going to feel some blood, right? But I can't feel any blood. And then when I stumble in front of the light, I can't see any blood on my hand, because I've had this spiritual stab vest on, right? So the idea is the spiritual stab vest means that I have felt wounded. I have felt cut by this 6-inch Bowie knife that this mugger had, but I haven't been wounded. And that's the closest that I've kind of got so far to describe the difference between feeling wounded and being wounded. And that's why I believe that we are unwoundable. That came to me as an aha moment. And in the same way as we were discussing early on, that it's hard to describe healing, it's hard to describe that moment of truth I had when I realized that I have felt wounded, but I haven't actually been wounded. Yeah.
I think it's maybe for me the difference between being killed and being hurt.
Okay. Yeah.
I don't think that deep down, whatever it is we're talking about can be killed.
Yeah.
But I think it can be hurt, but then it, can bounce back, it can heal, it can flourish.
Yeah.
Here's to flourishing.
Here's to flourishing. Right, we're going to have to do another podcast in a while, in a couple of months, because I think we've got to the really interesting bit there for me. That's
happy to do it.
Yeah, that would be great. I hope you have got something from this, listeners. If you're still listening now, then you probably have, I guess. It's been great for me. I hope you've enjoyed it too, Anne. And what you must have done, because you just volunteered to come back on again, and we'll pick up that conversation on another time. Thanks a lot, listeners, and thank you, Anne.
Thank you.